The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second of our three-part Business Office webinar series. This is John Toscano, and I co-lead Bloom's education practice. Because of our work with about 70 independent schools in many different capacities, we're fortunate to be able to see each school from a lot of different angles. That depth has made it possible for our team members to provide the guidance and solutions that are specific to your needs and challenges. And today's session on navigating HR and employment law challenges is a great example of that. Before we get started with our program today, Carly has some housekeeping matters to share with you.
Yes. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Navigating HR and Employment Law Challenges. We'll be getting started shortly, but first I want to take a couple of minutes to go over the format of today's webinar. All phones have been placed on mute for this webinar. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the questions tab in the menu. We will address questions at the end of the webinar as time permits. Any questions we don't get to on the webinar will be sent to the presenters to follow up on. We will also be recording this session, and the recording will be sent out after the webinar. If you are attending the webinar for CPE credit, you will need to complete the polling questions presented during the webinar, along with completing the follow-up survey that will be emailed out tomorrow morning. At this point, I'd like to turn it back over to John Toscano.
Thanks, Carly. As we work with our clients and speak with many other institutions throughout the year, one thing is for sure, personnel matters continue to be an area of special sensitivity. I'm happy to introduce to you today Frank Levesque, Director with Bloom Shapiro's HR Consulting Practice, and Attorney Tracy Thomas Boland, Partner at Morgan, Brown & Joy. Frank provides HR and people strategies and solutions for clients, including talent management, development, engagement and retention, compensation and benefits, HR practices and systems assessments, and policy and handbook design and development. Tracy provides counsel to clients on the full range of employment law issues, including performance management, investigations, wage and hour issues, leaves of absence and the accommodations process, discrimination and harassment issues and investigations, employment agreements, and severance and settlement agreements. I'm sure glad we have these two in our corner. Take it away, Frank and Tracy.
Great, thank you, John and Carly, and everyone who's taking the time to join us today. And I just wanted to do a quick shout out to Tracy. Tracy, are you with us?
I'm here, Frank. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Great, well, thank you. So in the time that we have today, we're going to be covering a lot of ground, and what we wanted to sort of the spirit of today is really to kind of remind ourselves about some of the areas within HR and employment law that, despite the fact that we're still dealing with a lot of the COVID-19 related issues around employment and employees and our businesses, it's important that we not lose sight of some of the more critical sort of hot topic areas within HR and employment law that don't go away, certainly just because of the challenges that we're dealing with right now as a result of COVID-19. So really what we're trying to do today is provide a refresher of sorts that will hopefully introduce some other insights and perspectives that you can bring back to your teams and your organizations in a way that will be useful for you. So our agenda will include a look at performance management, both from a sort of general feedback culture standpoint, as well as performance reviews, and talking about the importance of documentation in that process. We'll move into a culture of respect and sensitivity and maintaining a harassment-free culture, and then make our way into another hot topic these days, which is exempt or non-exempt, properly classifying employees, including a look at some of the developments as it pertains to independent contractors versus employees, which has been getting a lot of news and a lot of attention. And then we'll wrap up with a quick look at employee handbooks and take some questions, hopefully time permitting at the end. We had hoped to cover background checks and by association drug screening, but because of the content and the ground we wanted to cover today, we probably will not have time, or we will not have time to do that. But I encourage anybody who does have questions after today's session to reach out to either Tracy or myself if you do have any questions. So we'll talk about some of the most important challenging areas of the people side of your business, especially during these challenging times. Hopefully allow you to leave here with some practical tips and best practices to address those challenges. And although we're doing this remotely, there are going to be opportunities along the way for you to respond to some poll questions that'll help give us some context. And at the same time, Tracy and I are going to be incorporating some slides that'll be a little bit interactive on our end that will hopefully resonate with you and allow this to be at some level impactful for you and your organization. I wanted to briefly just show our 7-stage employee lifecycle and HR compliance assessment. This is a Bloom Shapiro HR advisory services tool that we use. That basically, we developed as a way to look holistically at the employee lifecycle. And we certainly won't be going through all of these areas today, but if you can kind of visualize an employee's relationship with the organization as having these 7 stages from the very beginning of attracting employees to when they potentially may leave the organization. This is a very sort of user-friendly way of looking at all of the different stages along the way that we utilize in our assessments as well. And as it pertains to today, particularly we'll be looking at primarily areas around engagement and management. So our first section is going to be on performance management. This is certainly not a new challenge for employers, especially during really an unprecedented time of how, when, and where employees are doing work, and remotely and in a hybrid environment. And a lot of the organizations, including many of our clients, understandably have been putting off the performance review process or canceling it entirely. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that, even with these pivots and adjustments, that, the importance of feedback, regular feedback, and especially as Tracy will speak to in a little bit, dealing with low performers and documentation, those critical pieces don't go away. So again, we're just trying to make sure that we're still mindful of these things and that we're equipped to manage them properly. So we'd like to start with our first poll question, if we could.
Sure. So, launch the first poll question. How effectively do you believe your organization, especially managers, is in delivering performance feedback?
And so what we're trying to do here is to just take a few seconds to tell us how you think your organization is doing in terms of delivering feedback. Just give it another 15, 20 seconds.
Sure. So 50% said very effective, 71% said somewhat effective, and 14% said not effective at all.
Okay, great, thank you. And so these results are not entirely surprising, only because organizations have always been challenged with effective performance feedback, and certainly there are many that do a good job with it and make a deliberate effort to do a good job at it. But there is always room for improvement, and whether it's keeping employees connected and engaged during times like this or managing risk for your organization, the importance of effective and consistent performance feedback can never be understated. So if we could move to the next slide. And just to bring a little bit of levity to things here, this is our friend Dilbert sitting at a table with his coworkers. One of them says, I got a text message from our boss, keep up WRK, which I guess means work. What does that mean? Well, you just got your annual performance review. And so this is a funny way of looking at how many organizations are, sort of not really, they're not walking the talk when it comes to a performance management, performance feedback kind of culture. So if you were to look back yourself and think back to a performance review or feedback that you've had in your career, and this is maybe where it might resonate the most, is to ask yourself, what was the most memorable experience you had with a manager or somebody who provided you with feedback, whether it was in a structured performance review or not, or conversely, maybe the most memorable review for not so positive reasons, and how that impacted you, and ultimately what role did that play in your motivation to do a good job, to want to go the extra mile for your employer. So the question we're asking here, and the one that you should be able to answer, is as we're establishing this culture of feedback, and whether it's informal or formal, what is it we're ultimately trying to achieve? And so whether it's positive or negative feedback, we need to make sure that ultimately we're creating a level of motivation on the employee's part to either keep doing what we want them to do, or to change, to pivot, or to stop doing something, sort of running the gamut there. And so again, just kind of hammering home here the importance of not just checking a box saying we got our reviews done, or sort of just having a very very surface level conversation with an employee that needs a much deeper conversation. What is it you're trying to achieve? So if we look at managing performance, listen, the HR guy here, the attorney, we can all, it's easy for us to sit here and tell you all these things, but I think we both will acknowledge that this stuff is hard. It's not easy. And so this can be one of the most overwhelming, difficult, and draining responsibilities of a manager, especially when it comes to underperforming employees. And if you've been managing employees for some time, I have to think that you would agree with that statement. It's time intensive. It just takes a lot of energy. It can be contentious. Ultimately, though, employees do need to know what's expected of them and how they're doing. And so, as I mentioned in my previous slide, if this is done well and consistently, it should be a motivating experience. We can go to the next slide. Some of these, or many of these, may be familiar to you as methods of evaluating performance. Certainly, informal feedback and coaching on a regular basis is key. Performance reviews are great, but they should never be a surprise. I like to call them sort of a formal pit stop along the way, whether it's annual or quarterly, to kind of reassess things and review goals. But never should there be a surprise in those situations if you're doing a good job with the regular informal feedback and coaching. Self-assessments, I have clients who swear by them for their employees, doing self-evaluations, 360-degree assessments as well. And then talent assessment tools, there are a multitude of them out there. The 9-box is one that we've used quite a bit, which measures potential and performance on a grid. And it's very useful during performance evaluation time. It's also useful in more challenging times, for example, in deciding to restructure or potentially even make tough decisions around layoffs or furloughs. So as we're talking about performance reviews, you always want to make sure you're sifting through the data that you have, giving equal time to good performance and to areas that need improvement. And always, 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 whether it's in performance reviews or in dealing with poor performers or situations that may not be as positive, you want to have specific examples that's backed up by documentation. And speaking of low performers, when we have to deal with low performers, we need to be clear and direct. I've sat with managers or very high-level leaders who have a very, very difficult time with being direct and sugarcoating messages that really are tough messages, but don't do anybody any favors by sugarcoating them. So there is certainly a process to this that goes far beyond the time that we have today, but ultimately we want to make sure that we're being clear, we're being direct, and that we're asking for commitment on the employee's part, because ultimately we can do everything possible as the employer, as the manager, but it's up to the employee to either change their behavior or think about potentially whether or not that role or that organization is right for them. And really, it should never be, unless it's the first time that that concern is coming up, this should never be a surprise on the employee's part. And as we're walking through the process, I won't go through every nook and cranny here, but we really want to make sure that we're doing the work on the front end as managers and leaders to identify what it is that we're looking to get out of this employee. What are the results we're looking for? And if there's a gap, where is that gap? And are our expectations of that employee realistic? And so how do you know that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing or not doing what they're supposed to be doing? And so we need to make sure we're putting the work in. And oftentimes this is working with someone from the HR department or perhaps in more difficult situations with an attorney to identify the gaps and make sure that we're fully prepared to have these conversations in a fair and an appropriate way. And this is just to reemphasize that especially when performance has been an issue for a long time, oftentimes managers just hope that the problem will just kind of go away on its own, or that we know the root cause, and ultimately what we see on the surface isn't necessarily where the root cause lies. So again, just re-emphasizing that the work needs to be done. And lastly, when it comes to root causes, is it an ability issue? Is it an effort issue? Is it something externally that's causing a problem for that employee, whether it's the tools that the employee has, any obstacles that are outside of their control, something going on at home? Again, we want to make sure we're looking through all of these lenses before we deal with low performers. And so there's a saying that says from Stephen Stowell, effective coaching requires a balanced discussion in which the leader first tries to understand before he or she tries to be understood. And then as we're providing feedback, we want to make sure we're being factual, stating our observations, repeating our expectations, and certainly being specific around why the performance or their actions were effective or ineffective. Make sure that there's an action plan developed. Gaining agreement with the employee is key, because ultimately it's up to the employee to turn their performance around. And as Tracy will mention in a minute, the importance of documenting these conversations in these meetings is critical. This is a quote from the movie Training Day from Denzel Washington, who said in that movie, "It's not what you know, it's what you can prove." I was reminded of this quote by a former colleague of mine who was an attorney, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tracy and ask also, if you might, along the way, Tracy, your perspective on how to approach these situations, especially if we're dealing with a long-term employee. Maybe they've been with the organization for 20 plus years, maybe even, and been allowed to sort of operate at that sort of low bar level of performance.
Yep, sure. Happy to do that, Frank. Thanks. So that was the perfect segue, I think, into the lawyer portion of this topic. Let me just start by saying that, as this slide indicates, any of you who have listened to HR professionals like Frank or employment lawyers on the management side like me on topics like this, you've heard us probably go on about all of the things you need to be careful about, where you need to tread lightly around the treatment of employees, including, as we see it here, things like their protected characteristics. So if they had, whether it's a race issue, a gender issue, a pregnancy issue, and the list goes on, you need to be mindful of where risk might lie given their protected class, their classes. If they have taken leave for what I call protected reasons, so under a state or federal paid time off law, or unpaid time, like the FMLA for larger employers on the call, Again, the list goes on. As we know, this is a highly regulated area. We need to be mindful of why they were out. Accommodations that are being offered for disabilities or for religious needs also are things that we talk about being in play. So again, these are all things we might be talking to you about if you wanted to make a decision about an employee as we assess the risk associated with the impact of that decision. And that we cannot retaliate against any employee and need to be mindful of actions that we take that might appear to be retaliatory for an employee, for instance, having previously come forward with a report about a manager, a complaint of sexual harassment, something like that in their past, and how our discipline on the heels or after those complaints might create risk for the organization. But you can go to the next slide, please. Having said all of that, you still can discipline and terminate employees. You'd be happy to know. As I said, we do have to assess the risk, but we still are empowered to run our organization and our school in this case the way that we need to and demand of employees what we need from them. The first bullet there I include because one of the things I hear all the time, and I'm sure Frank has heard plenty too, when the employer is asking for counsel about a termination decision or a discipline decision is, well, aren't they an at-will employee? And if they're an at-will employee, everything in our handbook and you lawyers and HR people say that means we can fire them for any reason or no reason. That's true, but like most things in life, there are exceptions to that blanket statement. Really, the way to say it is you can fire somebody for any lawful reason. And so we need to assess the things on the prior slide to make sure that the decision you're making isn't in fact because of any unlawful reason, or that it will more commonly is the case, maybe appear to be. Even if it appears to be because of one of those things, we have to be realistic about the fact that the employee could bring legal action challenging the real reason why you disciplined or terminated him or her. And as I've told lots of clients over my years of practice, you can spend a lot of money and time proving that you were right. So that's why we take the pause and assess the risk before we make those decisions. But we can, in fact, do it. Next slide, please. There's just a right way and a wrong way. And this is a little bit of a roadmap to the right way. You can fill in the whole slide, please, for efficiency. Thanks. This is a training that in and of itself, honestly, I spend an hour and a half doing for clients alone. So this is a very high level overview of the steps you might consider. But I think it's a good way to kind of wet your beak in terms of the things you should be thinking about as you go through the discipline process. This is a process that will help you make sure you are checking those boxes, that you are being mindful of the things you should consider, even if you feel you have, like, without a doubt, the right, for lack of a better way to put it, to discipline or to terminate. You still want to make sure for your protection and the protection of the organization that you are doing so in a thoughtful and organized way. So I'll go through these just at a high level, but step one is identify the problem and how it is affecting the business. So I'm just going to use just a simple example. Say you have one of those longtime employees that Frank mentioned as he turned it over to me. So you have a longtime teacher who has had ongoing problems in performance, kind of not executing on the job, been around a long time, maybe gotten a little lax in their follow through, don't really follow the curriculum or the syllabus as much as they used to, not really dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's anymore. Not doing anything particularly egregious, but just not really up to snuff in the way that they once were when they were maybe a little newer on the job and more motivated. So, you want to think about, just what is the problem and how is it affecting the business? Well, obviously for a school teacher who's not quite up to snuff and meeting the gold standard that your organization might aim for is a problem in terms of the education to the children and, of course, the reputation of the organization as a whole. Then identify any rights of the employee to engage in the conduct in question. So here, is there a reason? that this person is not engaging the way that they used to? Is this, something that they've identified that they're struggling with, some medical issue that they've reported, some
Muted.
mental health issue that they've reported? I'm just spitballing here. Of course, you could fill in a million examples or variables to the one I've chosen to use to illustrate the point, but I think you see my point. Rights or explanation of the employee, I would say, to engage in the conduct in question. What do we know about what's going on? Step 3, identify your responsibilities for addressing the issue. And Frank talked about this, but it's probably the most important thing here. How do you set the expectations? Because I hear a lot of clients who call and say, well, Joe Schmo is not teaching like he used to. He's been around a long time. I think it's just time for him to go. And what you're going to hear from me, or someone like Frank, I'm sure too, is, whoa, what have you told Joe about how things have evolved over the years, about how he has dropped off in his performance? Where can you show me that, to the documentation point? And I highly recommend that even when you think something has been documented, the people who would have to be counseling on and or approving discipline or termination, see it with your own eyes, because I can't tell you how many times I've been told, oh yeah, the performance evaluation told Joe that he wasn't, doing X, Y, and Z, that he wasn't meeting those expectations. And then, as this is exactly what Frank was talking about, you pull the performance evaluation and there's some like super soft language in there about how, how Joe took a different path this year or something like that. And in the manager, the supervisor, or the principal's mind, they absolutely did accomplish the goal. And maybe they said something more aggressive, but wrote something softer. That happens a lot too. But to Denzel's point, if you can't prove it, and when there's legal action, it basically didn't happen, I'm sorry to say. So you can't be too clear about that. You got to set the expectations before you can hold them accountable. Step 4, identify the resources available to you and your employees. So that's, again, it goes really hand in hand with 3. How are you helping? What have you done to help this employee be successful? Because yes, they're an at-will employee, and yes, we can discipline and terminate, technically speaking. But the best way to both effectively run your organization and to reduce, if not eliminate, legal risk as much as possible to your organization is to show that you worked with them before you took adverse action, as it's called. So is there coaching that can be available? Is there some sort of an improvement plan that you could put them on to actually work towards success and not just to get them out the door, those kinds of things. And then the last step, deliver feedback, document, and follow up. So issue progressive discipline. If your organization follows a progressive approach to discipline, make sure you comply with it, or else you could be sued for skipping the steps that you said you would offer. Most well-drafted handbooks should have a disclaimer that says an organization can skip steps in a progressive discipline process, but where you have it, try to comply with it, unless there's a real legitimate reason to skip a step and move more aggressively through that. And document. Again, I would talk about that for 20 minutes if someone let me. That again, if you don't show it in some sort of documentation that's dated with author's name on it, ideally, it's essentially a non-event. And then follow up, always circling back to make sure that you get somewhere with the employee about how it's going, that they know how you think it's going, and that you're closing that loop as you hopefully progress forward in a successful relationship. Next slide, please. Okay, what's worse than having a difficult conversation, the potential cost of avoiding one? Both Frank and I have alluded to that a bit already, but again, the long-term employee is a perfect example of what comes out of these challenging situations when they're not handled right. Take that Joe teacher I was just talking about, who's been around a long time and hasn't really been doing quite the job we expect of him for some years, but hasn't been dealt with. We haven't wanted to have the difficult conversation. Maybe he's that, quote, employee. You can see me air quoting in your mind, that employee who everyone just is like, oh, that's just how Joe is, and oh, he's going to be difficult, and it's going to be a tough conversation. He's going to push back and have a million reasons. You all know what I'm talking about. And then Joe goes out on a medical leave of absence. And now Joe needs to be out for God knows how long. And he's going to be out for potentially months, depending on the size of your organization and the laws that apply to him and provide him with protected leave. And now you're going to call one of us and you're going to say something like, I can get rid of him, right? Because he wasn't even good. I don't have to give him all this time off. and we're going to say, now you're stuck with him if you want to reduce your legal risk, because you didn't performance manage him out when you had the chance. Now you have a much riskier situation on your hands, because trying to terminate someone when they're out on a medical leave, or even right back from medical leave, carries a lot of additional risk. And you really are going to have to, again, if you want to reduce your legal risk, give him the time that he's entitled to, and then go through some performance management after that. So you're really extending your timeline. I could give you a million examples of litigation on my desk over the years that have stemmed from situations that really could have been nipped in the bud if we just got on it earlier. Next slide, please. Sorry, I know I'm talking quickly, but we have a lot to cover in a short period of time. So the cost of these missed conversations, again, I've alluded to some of them. But really, it can't be overstated. All these factors are real. I've seen them in a number of situations over the years, as I'm sure Frank has. This is what you're facing if you don't address these issues. Next slide, please. Why do we sometimes avoid these conversations? Again, as Frank said, there are high-level executives who just can't handle the confrontation of the situation. We understand that it's a real thing. The concern about the interpersonal issues, having to deal with the drama, being too busy, these are all legitimate concerns. I can just tell you, I'm going to say two things. One is invest in somebody who has some experience with human resources issues and or a willingness to embrace them. I understand that smaller organizations don't always have a quote HR person. They might have someone wearing multiple hats. If you are unable to resource-wise have a true HR professional on staff, or use somebody like Frank, make sure you have somebody in-house who, again, even if they don't have the experience per se, has a personality that can execute on leadership's guidance on these issues, if you know what I mean. It really needs to be embraced. Addressing these issues needs to be embraced as a job duty. And managers, principals, whoever in your organization is doing is holding the conversations, they're going to need some guidance from somebody who, again, either has the experience ideally or can give the counsel about being direct, frankly, and addressing it head on. Otherwise, both the quote business risks and the legal risks are coming. They would be unavoidable, and if these issues are not addressed. Next slide. This slide and the next slide are just a kind of a good visual reminders of tips about difficult conversations. I'm just going to address a couple that I think are, from my perspective anyway, the most important. Don't diagnose down in the bottom right-hand corner. That comes up when you take the issue with Joe. Say Joe, the teacher, was really slacking on the job in your mind, and it came out of nowhere. Maybe he's been good, up until very recently, and all of a sudden he's late, he's not prepared, he's not sticking to the plan, and you don't know why, but you assume, God, there's got to be something going on with this guy. He's got to have a medical issue, or maybe I heard maybe he was getting divorced, I don't know, and you sit him down to talk about his performance, and you go there. Don't go there quite so directly. It's not your job to guess as to what's going on with him. It is actually, in some cases, going to be deemed, a violation of his privacy or potential confidentiality issues under the ADA if you ask specific questions about medical issues and so forth. What you can do is invite him. Open the door to the conversation. So you sit him down and say, I noticed this is what's going on with you. This is what you're not doing. What is there something you want to talk with us about? Is there some way we can help you be successful? What's going on? Something like that, where you're inviting the conversation, but you're not diagnosing. Don't delay. Again, I don't mean to beat this to death, but waiting and not addressing the issue only creates more legal problems. It always seems to happen that the day before you were going to sit down and talk with the employee who's the problem, they announce the medical issue, or that they're pregnant, or that they're suffering from a mental health disease. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten that call. So please keep that in mind. Next slide. Set expectations, as we talked about. Again, I'm just going to hit on a couple here. And so the employee knows what's expected. If you ever find yourself in front of an MCAB or EEOC investigator, or God forbid a jury, you will be asked something that gets to, did the employee know what you expected of him or her, and what was going to happen if he or she didn't do it? they will want to know the answer to that question. So if you remember one thing from this section of the presentation, will you be able to answer those questions if it's ever tested? And then document. I always have to end on that note. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Frank.
All right, great. Thanks, Tracy. And as we both alluded to, I mean, that is a topic certainly that we could spend half a day, maybe even a day on. But it's an important reminder of the importance of, the regular ongoing feedback. I mean, employees deserve to know how they're doing, but it's also incumbent upon us as leaders in our organizations to make sure that we're not only treating employees appropriately, but also making sure that we're protecting the organization. So as we move into our next section, this is not necessarily a topic that's entirely new to everyone, I'm going to guess, but it's an important reminder, especially, again, at the risk of repeating myself here, during these challenging times, that our cultures maintain a level of respect and sensitivity that is really not about checking boxes or being legally compliant, et cetera, but about who we are as organizations, what our values are, and what's important to us. So we are going to go through a couple of the basic requisites and probably reminders for many of you on some of the considerations when it comes to both not just sexual harassment, but also just harassment in the workplace in general. And then we'll talk a little bit about the bystander role, which is a somewhat new concept to a lot of folks. And then Tracy, I'm not sure we'll have time for all 4 examples role plays, but we'll at least do a couple of those. So I'll turn it over to you.
That's great. Oh, you guys, your poll.
Unmuted.
We have our second poll question.
When is the last time your organization provided anti-harassment training?
Okay.
So the results are 68% within the last 12 months, 18% within the last 12 to 24 months, 4% more than 24 months, and 11% not sure or haven't conducted an analysis.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for your input there. Certainly, it's important to be conducting these trainings on a regular basis, not just for new hires, but also for our managers and employees, at least annually. And Tracy, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. Yeah, it makes me feel really good to see those numbers so high for within the last 12 months. And I agree. Just one last note on that. We often get the question whether training on sexual harassment and or other unlawful harassment is required in Massachusetts. And it does differ from state to state. So to the extent anybody has affiliation or other locations in other states, that's important to keep in mind. But it's not technically required in Massachusetts yet. The sexual harassment policy is, and the distribution of it is, but it is about as required as it can be without being required. If you are sued for sexual harassment in the agencies, especially here, the Mass Commission Against Discrimination or the EOC, you will be asked for information on your training, and these days they're looking to even see training materials. So just a quick note on how important it is to do, in our estimation, not just live training, but quality live training. The old kind of click through 15-minute things are no longer considered satisfactory by the MCAG or the EOC. So bear that in mind as you think about the training you're doing. Okay, why are we discussing this? From the lawyer's perspective, of course, I tend to be more focused on what the law requires and reducing the risk of the organization, but also important is the fact that we, of course, want to establish a certain kind of workplace. And as it says here, living our values and doing the right thing. And we want to execute on that from a leadership perspective all the way down. I'm still on the slide before, but you don't have to go back. I'll be done in 1 second. Thanks. Okay, the last bullet that says current climate in the world and mitigating risk, it's just really important to recognize, as I'm sure many of you do, the impact of the Me Too movement. Sexual harassment and other kinds of unlawful harassment, training for that obviously has been an issue for employers for many years and been unlawful for many years, but it's really been a sea change for employers what's happened in recent years. And while some employers took a kind of ostrich, stick your head in the sand, if I don't know what's not going on, if I don't know what's going on, I don't have to deal with it approach, that's just not going to cut it anymore. It really, again, needs to be something that's embraced with open arms, both from a messaging perspective to especially your younger employees who are much more mindful of Me Too type movements, but also from a legal perspective. Okay, next slide. So there's many different types of unlawful harassment. It's not just sexual harassment. That is the one we're talking about most today, and that gets the most attention, at least in recent years. But all of these listed here are the protected classes or protected characteristics, as they're called, under Massachusetts and federal law. Again, this list will change, add or subtract, well, not really subtract, but add a couple here and there in different states, so be mindful of that. But this is the list for Massachusetts. So any harassment on the basis of any of these things is going to be in violation of the law and should be in violation of any harassment policy that you have in your handbook. Bullying is also a form of harassment. Bullying, it's true, is being viewed through that lens and from the law's perspective. It is not in and of itself unlawful in Massachusetts yet, but there is a bullying in the workplace law that's being bandied about. So I think it's not long before bullying is in its own violation of the law, if you will. Next slide. So sexual harassment is the one type of harassment that has two types. There's quid pro quo, which literally means this for that. And most people understand to be a request for a sexual favor in exchange for some sort of work-related advancement. In what I call regular workplaces, we don't see that as much anymore. We still see it in Hollywood and the newsrooms apparently, but we don't see it as commonly. What we see much more commonly is the second one, hostile environment. Hostile work environment is harassment that results in the creation of harassment on the basis of a protected class that results in the creation of a hostile work environment. So essentially making it very difficult for employees who are experiencing this to be at work. This is almost always based on interpersonal communication. Again, this is more about that than discrimination is about, not getting a job because of your race or getting demoted because you're pregnant. That's more like bias that we see through the company action, formal action, whereas harassment, hostile work environment harassment is more about bias that we see through interpersonal communications, like jokes and texts and emails and inappropriate things that are inappropriate. Harassment can occur between coworkers as well as between employees and other third parties, I'll call them. So just a quick note that while we talk a lot about harassment kind of within our four walls, wherever those walls are these days in the COVID world, it's not just the people that we employ. If there are people coming into our workplace in one form or another, a FedEx delivery person, a spouse at a party, something like that, third parties that we invite in, if you will, to our events, our organizations, we own their behavior too, and the same role should apply to them. Next slide. So this is a bit of a summary of the legal standard. So if I say, oh, I've experienced sexual harassment at work, I think, and I want to sue my employer for it, these are the kinds of things that I have to prove. The one that we spend the most time on in the legal world is the last one that says, I have to show that my experiences were so severe or pervasive to make it essentially impossible for me to be at work. Again, that's a legal standard that speaks to how bad things were and how long it went on. So I have to show either that something was really, really bad and happened once, like, for instance, a physical touching or inappropriate, someone showing a body part or something like that. And if it's not that severe, it was more mild, like, say, people commenting on my clothes and how my body looked in the clothes and things like that here and there. I have to show that happened regularly and for some period of time. That's the boiled down definition. I use this just to explain to you as employers that your policy and your practice should not reflect just a legal standard, because if I come to you, my manager, and say, or my principal, and say, this is what I'm experiencing, I don't like the way that that guy looks at me, he's made a couple of comments about how my dresses look from the back or something like that, you're not going to say, well, that doesn't meet the legal standard. You're going to say, okay, well, let's hear more about that, because you should defer to me and my experience as your employee, because the goal here is to nip it in the bud before it gets maybe to the legal standard. So we are going to, that's the kind of the approach that you should take when you hear someone's concerns around that. Next slide. Just some thoughts about things that people don't always think about regarding sexual harassment, and frankly, these really all apply to harassment on the basis of any protected class. But if the first bullet, it says that the victim as well as the harasser may be a woman or a man. The goal of this is just to remind everybody that while we think about the protected classes, race, gender, sex, religion, we think about them in terms of protecting what I call the kind of underrepresented subgroup. So for race, Black or brown people; for sex, it's women; that for religion, it's the lesser recognized religions, perhaps in our country. For sexual orientation, it's the gay people. But all these protected classes apply to everyone within it, and it goes in every direction in terms of the experiences that people have. If you're being harassed on the basis of your race and your race is white, that is harassment on the basis of race. If you're being harassed as a man on the basis of your gender, some woman is sexually harassing you, that is unlawful sexual harassment potentially. So it's not just the way that we tend to think about it, it goes in every direction. The victim does not have to be the person harassed, but could be anyone affected by the offensive conduct. That's true. And even more broadly, frankly, if someone is engaging in conduct on the basis of protected classes at work, regardless of whether they can prove that someone was offended, it's still a problem. As an employer, if you hear people talking like that, using that kind of language in the workplace, as a manager, they should be advised this needs to come forward and be checked out, because it doesn't matter just whether someone is formally taking the position that they're offended. It's still a problem. I'm just going to go to the next slide. I can hand it back over to Frank in the interest of time. Just quick, fear factor examples of the kinds of losses. We mentioned here that both company examples and individual examples. I just want to say briefly, again, I might have mentioned this at the outset, that supervisors in Massachusetts and in many states have an elevated level of liability, meaning if a supervisor engages in any sort of unlawful harassment, liability to the organization is immediate. So there's almost no defense to those kinds of behaviors by supervisors, which is just emphasizing the need to train supervisors on these issues and make sure that they understand they are held to a higher standard. Next slide. Just to note legal risks and other risks, particularly other risks, family and career. I don't think anybody wants to go home telling their husband or wife that they were fired for harassing somebody at work on the basis of their sex, and that can be a motivator when training people. And you can give lots of stories about people who have hurt many aspects of their lives, not just their work life from these behaviors. So, with that, I'll hand it back over to Frank.
Great. So just in wrapping up here with the time that we have, inappropriate behavior can occur certainly in a number of different settings. And in today's world, that most certainly includes social media, social events. And I can't tell you how many times we've had to deal with these types of situations that involve something on social media or something that was transmitted on text or what have you. So it certainly has become much more expansive than we've sort of traditionally known it to be. Next slide. The point of this slide is to understand that it's not just about the harasser, victim, the manager, or HR. The bystander is someone that is empowered to do something. A lot of folks feel like if they're not the manager or they're not HR, then they don't have a role. Well, the fact is that they do have a role and they are empowered to do something. And certainly, as Tracy mentioned, if you are a manager, you are obligated to do something. You're essentially the eyes and ears of the organization. Next slide. So as a bystander, certainly don't feel obligated to confront the harasser in these moments, though common sense and judgment do play a role. So there may be situations where you feel as if, disrupting what's going on is appropriate, but, ultimately don't start your own investigation. That's not your area of expertise. That's what we have HR and attorneys for, employment law attorneys. And, whenever, you encounter these situations or someone on your team encounters these situations, report it. The worst thing that can happen is that we find that there's been no, conduct that's been, that rises to the level of harassment. It might be inappropriate, but still always best to report these. And then, as I mentioned, as manager, you are the eyes and ears of the organization. So you always want to make sure that complaints are taken seriously. Never dismiss them at the onset, and certainly, as we talked about before, don't delay. Once it gets in the hands of HR or an employment law attorney or someone who's handling investigations, the who, what, when, and where will be obtained, and confidentiality will be kept, not guaranteed, but certainly kept to a need-to-know basis only. Retaliation is the most common complaint filed with the EEOC. I think it's more than, at least in 2019, was more than half the charges that were filed with the EEOC. So that certainly is as important to make sure that employees and managers know as much as the rules around inappropriate conduct itself when it comes to harassment. And as Trace mentioned, your company can be liable for supervisor conduct. Now, in the interest of time, we don't have the opportunity to go through our scenarios, but I will just tell you that the scenarios that we typically will work through in a workshop are deliberately very gray, and that's because in real life, it's very rare that you have a slam dunk set of facts and information. There's just always a whole lot of gray that we're working with, and so these situations can be very difficult in responding to and dealing with, and we're never going to pretend that the stuff again is easy to deal with, but just know that that's 99% of the time there's a lot of gray involved. So if we just want to wrap up with our last section, just skip ahead to the exempt or non-exempt section.
It's too bad they won't get the advantage of our Oscar-winning performance on the high.
I know. Right? I've been rehearsing for weeks. But this has been a hot topic of late, classifying employees as exempt or non-exempt, and even more so, or maybe equally, independent contractor or employee. So I'll just, if you want to have our last poll question here.
So the last poll question is, when is the last time your organization evaluated the exemption and employee status of employees and independent contractors?
Okay.
The final results show 44% within the last 12 months, 24% within the last 12 to 24 months, 8% more than 24 months, and 24% not sure or haven't conducted an analysis.
Okay, so I mean, somewhat encouraging that almost half have done something along these lines, and maybe it's something that you do on a regular basis. Maybe it's because certainly of the headlines that have been, no secret around Uber's classification of employees and independent contractors, and I think Microsoft had a problem with it a few years ago as well. But the point being that this is definitely something that, whether it's the independent contractor employee relationship or the non-exempt status of an employee, this is becoming more and more of a concern and a hot topic out there. So if we could just advance to the next slide. What's the most common and potentially costly Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the federal law that basically deals with wage and hour law made by employers? And that is employee classifications, which can be very costly, as we'll note in a minute. Next slide. Salaried employees are automatically exempt from overtime. True or false? That is false. the fact that you have decided to make an employee a salaried employee does not then in and of itself grant an exemption from overtime, nor does, well, I don't want to give away the answer to the next slide, but next slide. Job title determines whether an employee should be exempt or non-exempt. I'm a production manager.
It says manager.
Yeah, I'm a manager. It's the job duties along with the salary threshold, which, by the way, was just increased, that determine whether or not someone is exempt from overtime or not. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy to bring us to close with this section and the presentation.
I mean, I talk fast, but exempt, non-exempt, and independent contractors in 3 minutes or less is a challenge. So forgive me. But I just want to say real quickly, if, you know, I know Frank agrees, like any questions that folks want to talk out that, you know, we're happy to do, but please follow up with us separately. We always do our best to try to not be rushed, but sometimes it's hard to anticipate the exact time period. So please feel free to contact us. Yes, as Frank said, in January of this year, the salary basis threshold went to $684 per week. And then as Frank alluded to, my main message on the section is please to remember that it is the salary basis and the job duties basis together, those two tests that will tell you whether you can lawfully classify someone as an salaried exempt employee. The second bullet here are the main categories of what they call them white collar exemptions. Those of us in the business don't like that explanation because it can be misleading, but that's what you'll see them described as. There are a number of factors for each of the executive, administrative, professional, and so on that you have to be able to satisfy. The criteria list there is a sampling of examples of some of the things, but it really is, I think, very opposite of what common sense might tell you in some cases. So it's one of those things that it is worth drilling down on. It's a pretty complex factual analysis. So you have to really dive in with someone who's experienced, if you're not, to help make that determination about whether the duties are sufficient to satisfy the exemption. Next slide, please. Just a couple of highlights from here. Again, it's not just kind of blue collar jobs, my reference. The default assumption should be that the worker is non-exempt, and then there's a small percentage of them that will be properly classified as exempt. It's again, a lot of issues that have to do with what they're really doing, you know, producers versus operating, what kind of judgment they have to use in executing their duties and how often. I won't get into all of those details because it's so specific to the exemption and the position in question, but just understand that default. And then, of course, those employees who are non-exempt, properly classified, have to be paid for all hours worked, even if they're, quote, off the clock. Next slide. For independent contractors, this is a sampling of the considerations, and Massachusetts has the strictest independent contractor test in the country. We like to be out front, as you know, with the regulation of our employers. And what it boils down to is again, the default should be that the default assumption should be that the worker is an employee, and that if you can satisfy this three-part test, can you demonstrate that they satisfy the independent contractor status. How much is the employee, is the company directing the work of the employee? Does the contractor perform the same kind of work that the business does? Or are they providing a service different than the work of the business? So the easy example for that one, because this is the one that trips up most organizations with contractors. The main thing would be, a simple example would be, I'm a law firm, I have a cleaning company who comes in that's a contractor. They are providing a service we don't provide, but I can't have a lawyer as an independent contractor because that's the business of our business. And then does the worker provide this service for other organizations, or in other words, does it look and walk like a duck in the sense such that are they really kind of established the same way as other employees, getting the same benefits and perks, et cetera, in which case they're more likely to be classified as an employee. You have to show all three of the main factors in order to properly and safely classify them as contractors. Just a couple of quick points of things I get all the time. No, it doesn't matter that the employee wants the contractor status. That's not going to reduce your legal risk. No, it doesn't matter if you have a contract with them that says they're an independent contractor. That's not going to be a defense should they challenge it down the line. And no, it doesn't matter if the employee or the worker makes more as an independent contractor than they would if they were an employee. In the eyes of Massachusetts, none of those things matter. If they're misclassified, they're misclassified. And then next slide. If they are misclassified, you are exposed for quite significant monetary damages, both for what they didn't get by way of potentially pay or more likely benefits that they didn't receive that they would have been entitled to and paid time off as an employee. And you are open to fines and penalties from the state of Massachusetts. If there's litigation and you lose, you have to pay not just for a lawyer like me to help you through that, but then you also have to pay for the person's attorney's fees who sued you, which is a super fun way to end the litigation. And we can look back, the law looks back 2 to 3 years based on different factors. So meaning it's not just what the person didn't earn last week as an employee, it's what they didn't earn for up to the past 2 or 3 years. Again, that 2 or 3 depends on some details I won't go into here. So on the last slide for me, just one point I think I want to highlight here in the interest of time is when you do identify that somebody's been misclassified, both either as exempt, non-exempt, or independent contractor, don't run away from it out of fear that you're going to have to tell the person. And people often wonder about, well, aren't I just creating legal exposure right now? They're happy and no one's complaining. It's always better to stop the bleeding, if you will, because the legal risk keeps mounting and those wages, those lost wages and fines are just going to grow over time. So it's appropriate to do it as soon as possible and to take care with your messaging. There's a right way to tell the employee that they've been misclassified this whole time and a wrong way. And people like Frank and I can help you with that. And with that, I will stop talking.
Okay, so as we wrap up here, just one last note. A lot of our clients have been dusting off their handbooks, which have not been updated in a long time. Understandably so. There's been a lot of activity legislatively and just in terms of new policy development, where, when, and how workers are working and all that. So I know that for some, they're a little bit resistant to having a handbook, that it might be overly contractual, bind them to things and all that. And to some degree, the binding piece is true. I mean, you need to do what you say you're going to do or not. But I will tell you, at least in our estimation, that we have we find that employee handbooks, or as we call them, team reference guides, are very helpful to have. They're not necessarily the 15-pound, 200-page paperweights that get dumped on you in orientation anymore. They're really great employer branding tools. They're a way to reinforce your core values, your mission, and certainly at the same time make sure that you are communicating and sharing the information that needs to be shared with employees, both from a legal standpoint, but just from a cultural standpoint. So. And someone like myself would be able to review an handbook or create a new one and ultimately partner with someone like Tracy to make sure that from a legal perspective, everything is the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. So I think with that, we are about at the end here, and I don't know, Carly, that we have time for Q&A, unfortunately, but we are happy to, if you want to bring up our contact information, we're happy to answer any questions on topics that we've covered today that maybe we just didn't have time for, or if there's something else that is on your mind, please feel free to reach out to either one of us, and we'll be happy to help. And that's it from our end.
Thanks for having me, Frank. Good to talk with you all. Sorry for the rush speech. Have a good day.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Frank
All right,
and Tracy. That's definitely an area not to be taken lightly. Just in closing, we wrap up our 3-part series on Tuesday, October 20th. So please join myself and Jennifer Hillen from NBOA for a discussion about the state of independent schools. Hope everybody has a great day, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, John. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.